Helps if I unmute myself. Hello, students, and welcome to today's History 1302 live stream. Today, we will be talking about Nixon, Watergate, and the aftermath of Watergate. Nixon is one of these presidents that people commonly think was impeached. The reality was that Nixon actually resigned before impeachment could be formally voted on, although the process, the investigation, and the House determination about whether impeachment was warranted was already ongoing. So we're going to talk a little bit about Nixon's time as president. We're going to talk about this transition that we experienced from the 60s to the 70s, and this shift towards a growing social conservatism and political conservatism in the United States that we start to see happen in the 70s. And we'll talk about how this is related to Watergate and a lack of public trust in government. So you will recall Richard Nixon from an earlier chapter in the textbook when we talked about the 1950s, because Nixon was the vice president of Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s. We had mentioned that Nixon's early career in Congress had been boosted by his pursuit of Alger Hiss as a suspected communist spy within the State Department. And he had run against and lost to John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election. So Richard Nixon had been experienced in national politics. And in 1968, once Lyndon Baines Johnson decides not to run for re-election following the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, then Nixon sees his opportunity. There's really no clear agreed upon candidate for the Democratic Party. As you guys read about, the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago devolved into rioting outside and some violence on the floor of the convention as well. And Hubert Humphrey ends up getting the nomination for the Democratic side. Hubert Humphrey was Lyndon Baines Johnson's VP, and he was not sufficiently anti-war for a lot of Democrats who wanted a candidate like, say, Eugene McCarthy, who was running on an anti-war platform. So Hubert Humphrey is the Democratic candidate for 1968. Richard Nixon, again, runs for president, his first time since losing to John F. Kennedy in 1960. And Nixon runs on a platform that he calls the silent majority. So according to Nixon, he felt that the vast majority of Americans, ordinary Americans, felt the 1960s had gone too far and too radical, and that they welcomed a return back to the social and political conservatism of the 1950s. And he called them the silent majority because he said, you know, these people are not out on the streets protesting like all of these young people for different civil rights movements. You know, they're not vocal, they're being looked over, they're being ignored by media and politicians. And he campaigned for a return to law and order, which was a very poignant message in 1968, given the wave of riots that we saw following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. that same year. The third candidate in the 1968 race is George Wallace, a Southern governor who ran on the Independent Party platform. And almost all of his platform was a knee-jerk reaction to the expansion of civil rights for African Americans. So in many ways, George Wallace is kind of a little bit of a holdover legacy of the Dixiecrats from the late 40s and early 50s, the Democrats who were largely opposed to civil rights. So in 1968, Nixon actually wins the popular vote by a slim margin, only 43%, and he ends up winning the Electoral College pretty handily. George Wallace actually wins 13% of the popular vote, which is nothing to sneeze at. That's a really healthy percentage for a third-party candidate. So with that, Nixon becomes president. And Nixon is a very interesting man for a number of reasons. One is he's running on this platform of wanting to return to political and social conservatism, but he's not necessarily conservative in the way that we think of political conservatives today as of this recording in 2021. When it came came down to social issues, Nixon is actually in some ways leaning more sort of Democrat, more progressive on his ideas of social issues. And so in many ways, he is much more similar to his predecessor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, when it comes to things like wanting to revamp welfare, for example, than he is to his Republican Party. When it comes to foreign policy, he is more conservative. That is definitely his preferred focus as a president, is on foreign policy. One of the things he campaigned on was wanting to get us out of Vietnam and achieve an exit strategy there. And at the same time, though, he's not a sort of blind war hawk. He did spend a lot of time with his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, during this time period, trying to pursue more peaceful relationships with the Soviet Union and with China, because he did not see the point in antagonizing these communist foes. So on domestic politics, again, he has a mixed track record. He does end up continuing to expand the welfare state, which was given a great boost by President Johnson's Great Society program. As I mentioned, Nixon is often more in the political center when it came to social issues. And in many ways, his continued support of some of the policies introduced by Johnson's Great Society served to legitimize them by giving them a bipartisan sort of sheen and label. So Nixon also, when you look at his track record in terms of the federal government, really comes across as a centrist, or what we would today consider a centrist. There's a slew of new federal agencies created during Nixon's time in office. One of them is the Environmental Protection Agency, which was established to regulate pollution in the environment, which is very interesting because today when we think about environmentalism, oftentimes, in again, the year 2021, we're thinking more Democrats, not necessarily Republicans, but the EPA is established by a Republican president, because at this time, environmentalism was seen as a bipartisan issue in the late 60s and early 70s. He also establishes OSHA and NTSB. OSHA is Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and then NTSB is the National Transportation Safety Board. So both of these were designed to look at and enforce safety standards for the workplace in the case of OSHA, and for consumers and travelers in the case of the NTSB. And these were prompted by concerns over workplace and consumer safety. For example, Ralph Nader, who ran for the Green Party several times for the presidency, was the author of a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, which exposed shoddy workmanship, quality, and safety issues in automobiles, for example. Environmental legislation, as I mentioned, at this time was seen as bipartisan. The modern environmentalism movement in the United States, most historians pinpoint to the publication of biologist Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, in which she studied the dangers of the pesticide DDT. DDT had been used as a pesticide by farmers and was even advertised for you to use in your own home as a way to keep bugs out. But the health implications of DDT, not only for humans, but also on animal populations, was largely understudied until Carson's book. So there's a growing awareness within the 60s and the 70s of the fact that human chemicals, human emissions were contributing to a negative quality of life, particularly not only pesticides, but also air pollution or smog. In LA during the 1960s, the air quality was so bad that just breathing the air in Los Angeles was the equivalent to smoking several packs of cigarettes a day for your lungs. So this is a very big public health issue. So we're going to see Nixon's administration work with Congress to pass a bunch of environmental regulations. In addition to establishing the Environmental Protection Agency, we're also going to see the Endangered Species Act focusing on conservation of wildlife, passed in 1973, the Clean Air Act, passed in 1970, and the Water Pollution Control Act and Pesticides Control Act, both passed in 1972, as a way to try to minimize the damage caused. So one of the things that these acts did was aim to reduce pollutants in the environment. In particular, the Clean Air Act wanted to target 6 major airborne pollutants by 1/3 in 10 years. So that was the goal behind regulating these. And it actually led to a decline of 95% in lead in the atmosphere by switching over to things like unleaded gasoline. If you ever wondered why that was listed at the pump, that's why. So as I mentioned, Nixon is oftentimes to the sort of what we would call the left of the spectrum of his political party on the issue of welfare. Welfare for a long time had been predominantly seen as an issue that Democrats are more concerned with. I mean, when you look at things like the New Deal programs, the creation of Social Security, for example, and your textbook also talked about and how in the 1950s, once we had our first Republican president post FDR and Dwight D. Eisenhower, how a lot of Republicans hoped that that would be a way to kind of curb the system of welfare, but Eisenhower instead supported it because he saw value in it. So what Nixon is going to do is, again, kind of look at welfare programs expanded by Johnson and his Great Society push, and he's actually going to pursue reforms that he sees as improving the system. And so instead of dismantling it, the system of welfare, he's trying to improve it. So under Nixon, we see the expansion of the food stamp program, or what we today call SNAP. So providing benefits for folks in poverty to be able to access food sources. He formally indexes Social Security benefits to inflation. Prior to this time, the amount of benefits that people got from Social Security was flat and did not adjust if the value of the dollar adjusted. So now that is fixed, so we don't have the issue of lagging buying power. But probably the biggest proposed change that Nixon had that earned the ire of his own political party was the change to the Aid to the Families with Dependent Children program. So this program dated back to the New Deal time period. The initial goal of the program was to help families with children who had lost their primary breadwinner. Okay, so mainly widows and orphans is the idea here. And when this was first created during the New Deal, most of the families that benefited from the AFDC were poor whites. But because of demographic changes, by 1970, half of the recipients of the AFDC were African American. The number of families enrolled in the program also grew in the 1960s because we had a rise in birth rates to single mothers and a growth in the number of female-led households. So a lot of political conservatives looked at this and they started saying, well, these people don't want to work hard. They just kind of want to live off of the government, right? They're just looking for free handouts. Whereas Nixon was like, well, you know, these people do need help, but we need to streamline how the program works to make it more efficient. So Nixon proposed, rather than this sort of labyrinthine system that already existed for determining who got AFDC money and how much, Nixon proposed instead what he called a minimum income of $1,600 annually to every low-income family. So just make it really simple. If you qualify, you get this amount. Now, if you're wondering what that is in today's money, that's about $10,000. Okay, so in other words, it's still not a whole lot of money. Can you live on $10,000 a year? And keep in mind, this money is only going to adults with children. The answer is no. In a lot of places, 10,000 is not going to get you very far. So when Nixon proposed this, his own political party said, no, this is going to create a culture of dependency. We shouldn't give these people any money. And then on the other side of the spectrum, the Democratic Party said $10,000, or what is today the equivalent of $10,000, is not enough. This money is not enough to really substantially help these people. So Nixon was getting it from both sides. And so this proposed overhaul of the program is actually going to be blocked in 1970. So Nixon's attempt to kind of streamline this to make it simpler, less red tape, ends up backfiring. Now, as I mentioned, Nixon, while he is willing to take on things like reforming welfare, his real focus as a president is on foreign policy. And his sort of chief national security advisor is his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who, yes, is still alive as of this recording. Henry Kissinger set a lot of Nixon's foreign policy, and in particular, they adopt a strategy of trying to destabilize any foreign governments that were deemed hostile to American interests. What does this mean? Well, throughout Asia and Latin America, the US government ends up employing the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, in covert operations to undermine leaders that they dubbed too radical or dangerous to American influence in these regions. And I should note, this is not new. Remember, you read in your textbook in the 1950s, the United States was doing the same thing in places like Guatemala and Iran. So this is simply a continuation of US Cold War policy to kind of use secret operations and agencies like the CIA to influence foreign governments and to kind of try to control them for the benefit of the United States, both our political and economic interests. So because of that, Nixon's administration is going to continue this legacy that we have of the United States supporting anti-communist governments just because they're anti-communists. So that's the only thing we're looking at is, are you anti-communist? We're not looking at their human rights records. We're just concerned with whether they hate communism or not. And we're willing, just on that basis, to give them military training and aid. Okay. So this is going to lead to the United States getting involved in things that we find very questionable today. For example, in Chile, the socialist Salvador Allende was elected in a democratic election in 1970 to lead Chile. The CIA supported a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet in 1973, which overthrew and killed Allende and subsequently suspended democracy in Chile until the end of the 1980s. And we saw lots of disappearances, lots of violence, lots of very anti-democratic tactics by the Chilean government. And again, the United States supported this because they were anti-communist. So even though Chile's government under Pinochet committed multiple human rights abuses and essentially carried out a secret war against their own citizens, anyone who disagreed with the regime of Pinochet, the United States continued to support Chile because they were anti-communist. This is one of many reasons why there are quite a number of people who believe that former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger should probably have been arrested and charged with war crimes. So when it came to the bigger sort of entities that it was very difficult for the United States to influence with the CIA and secret operations. So when it came to China and the Soviet Union, for example, the United States recognized that they could not wholesale topple these regimes, but instead what they wanted to do was to have a more realistic working relationship with both of these nations. In particular, there was a hope that if we could kind of come up with a truce, or what we call détente, a period of sort of thawed relationship, a little bit better working relationship. We're not as hostile. We're actually talking to each other. That might help the United States de-escalate the conflict in Vietnam. Kissinger is going to be sent to China to negotiate an ease in trade restrictions, and Nixon becomes the first president since China had become communist to visit China in 1972. And he was actually responsible for orchestrating the United States formally recognizing China and establishing a full diplomatic relationship with China as of 1979. And at that point, the United Nations also recognized Communist China as the sole representative of China in the United Nations as of 1973, which was a big deal because up until this point, both the United States and the United Nations have been recognizing Taiwan as the legitimate representative of China. And remember, Taiwan was controlled by those who had fled the communist revolution following the fall of the nationalist cause under Chiang Kai-shek. When it came to the Soviet Union, Nixon also becomes the first president to visit the Soviet Union in 1972 to negotiate with then Premier Leonid Brezhnev. They do have talks designed to limit the development of new nuclear weapons. This is what we call SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, in 1969. It does a lot to say we should kind of limit research and development on new things, but it doesn't really address proliferation of existing technology. So we're still going to have that arms race going on. Although there was an incentive to minimize proliferation with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which banned the development of anti-missile technology, with the thought process that developing this defensive technology would just encourage us to act first, to push the button first, so to speak, in a nuclear conflict rather than, think about it. So the purpose of all of this was to try to lower these fears of nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, as I mentioned, one of Nixon's focuses on his campaign was in getting the United States out of Vietnam. And Nixon proposes to do this with a strategy he calls Vietnamization. So his idea is that we should shift more of the burden on fighting to South Vietnamese troops. So that way they can still fight against the communist North Vietnamese, but we're not employing as many of our troops to do that, right? So that allows us to get some troops out of Vietnam. And in support of this strategy, he issues what he calls the Nixon Doctrine in 1969, where he says the U.S. would aid anti-communist forces in Asia. However, these nations needed to bear the brunt of the fighting. So we're going to help you, but we would rather send you military supplies and money than put boots on the ground. He continued Johnson's bombing halt of North Vietnam as of 1968, but continued ground combat. So even though he's pushing for the United States to get out of Vietnam, it's not an immediate push. The United States also gets involved in Cambodia to try to target North Vietnamese sympathizers, not synthesizers. The United States sends troops into neighboring Cambodia and Laos, which ends up destabilizing politics in both nations and contributing to the rise of the communist Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. If the name Khmer Rouge rings a bell, they carried out genocide against the Cambodian people. So our involvement in Cambodia and Laos actually kicks off full-fledged genocide. We have a wave of anti-war protests as the years are starting to go by in Nixon's administration, and we're still involved in combat in Vietnam. College campuses saw widespread protests in 1970. 350 colleges or universities had anti-war protests on campus that year. 21 of them experienced occupation by federal troops. Of these, we saw deadly clashes at 2 campuses, Jackson State, a primarily Black university in Mississippi, and Kent State in Ohio, which was primarily a university catering to working class people. At those clashes, several students were killed by federal troops. That's actually an event that our history department is going to have next week, is having someone who was at the Kent State shooting come and talk about his experience. So I highly recommend looking at Blackboard for that link. And soldiers in Vietnam increasingly rebelled against the war as well, by either resisting orders or fragging, aka shooting or injuring, unpopular officers. And in some cases, soldiers just deserted their posts. Veterans also started publicly protesting the war. So all of this anti-war feeling comes to a head with the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. So the Pentagon Papers were actually a top secret history written by the American government that was deeply critical of involvement in Vietnam. Many times, government agencies and institutions in the United States will write their own histories of campaigns and conflicts. The CIA does this quite often, but that's for internal consumption, not publication. And in this case, this history that had been written for internal use only of American involvement in Vietnam was leaked to the press by Daniel Ellsberg, who was an anti-war activist who had worked in national security. To respond to the leak of the Pentagon Papers, Richard Nixon utilized his own personal intelligence unit, nicknamed the Plumbers, to try to stop the leaks and also undermine Ellsberg's credibility by doing things like ransacking his psychiatrist's office to get his private medical records. He also tries to get a court injunction from the Supreme Court to stop the release of the papers, and the Supreme Court actually rejects it. So the Pentagon Papers become circulated, and the U.S. government itself, and in this account being highly critical of Vietnam, increases anti-war sentiment and this push to get out. So the United States ends its involvement in Vietnam in the early 1970s. The Easter Offensive of 1972 showed the limits of putting the burden of fighting on the South Vietnamese. Nixon actually escalated the war further in December 1972 with round-the-clock bombing campaigns, which finally drove both sides to peace talks. In 1973, both sides signed a peace treaty that agrees to Americans getting out of Vietnam. And by 1975, Vietnam was reunified after the North Vietnamese invaded South Vietnam. So the United States is officially out of Vietnam by the end of 1975. The overall cost of our decades-long involvement in Vietnam is about 58,000 troops killed, 2,000 missing, 150,000 wounded, Overall, 3.5 million Americans served in the Vietnam War, and many of these veterans had longstanding health issues caused by the war, including exposure to chemicals such as Agent Orange, which was used to deforest Vietnam. 3 to 4 million Vietnamese also died in this war, and the United States spent hundreds of millions of dollars. The Vietnam War also has two side effects that are going to have repercussions for the United States. One is it creates more caution in using American military overseas, at least for a couple of decades. And this is what we call Vietnam syndrome. So in other words, we're going to think twice about deploying troops overseas, unless we're part of an international coalition or we have a clear exit strategy, because we want to avoid another sort of decades-long disaster like Vietnam. Spoiler alert, that caution only lasts so long. We've been in Afghanistan for 2 decades now, as of this recording. The other unintended consequence of Vietnam is it's going to contribute to this increasing, among a certain segment of the population of returning veterans, this increasing bitterness and this lack of faith in the government and the United States. That's actually going to lead to the rise of the militia movement and white power movements in the United States. And we'll talk more about that in later weeks. Now, it's not Vietnam that brings down Richard Nixon. It's a scandal called Watergate. So when Nixon runs for re-election in 1972, he's running against George McGovern, who is a senator from South Dakota who is running on an anti-war platform, because as of 1972, we're still in Vietnam. George Wallace tried to run again, but somebody tried to assassinate him, so he stepped out. And Nixon won the election pretty well. He did better than his 1968 showing. He actually won 60% of the popular vote. Where Nixon got into trouble was that Nixon was a very famously paranoid man, and a man who did not accept differences of opinion. He actually kept an enemies list of people who opposed him or disagreed with him politically. And there was also an organization called, and I kid you not, I can't make this up, CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, which formed to illegally raise millions of dollars for his campaign, contrary to campaign finance laws. So where this comes to a head is that in order to keep tabs on his political rivals, operatives from CREEP tried to install eavesdropping equipment on the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building in June of 1972, and they were caught and arrested. Nixon's administration ended up paying hush money and interfering with the attempt to investigate this through the election until early 1973. So Nixon is able to keep this quiet long enough to get elected. Once the court prosecution of the Watergate burglars starts, and it becomes evident that there's a connection between these guys and Nixon, Congress forms what they call the Watergate Committee in May of 1973 to investigate the break-in and to try to determine the level of cooperation that had happened between CREEP and Nixon. And to do that, they wanted to access voice-activated recordings from Nixon's office. And Nixon took them to court. He initially released tapes which were edited, which had cut things out, including infamously an 18-minute long gap in the tape. So we have a court case about getting the unredacted or unedited version of the tapes, U.S. v. Nixon, at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court orders Nixon to release the tapes. At that point in time, the House of Representatives is looking at impeachment. Now, remember, the process of impeachment is that the House of Representatives is responsible for investigating and determining whether there is enough there to bring charges of impeachment. And then they have to vote on whether they approve those charges. After that point, a president, or this can also apply to any federal level official, is considered impeached. But they don't lose power yet, because the second part is after an individual is impeached, they have to have a trial in the Senate, in which case the Senate is going to examine the evidence and determine whether the person should be found guilty on the charges of impeachment. At that point, if they are found guilty, they are then removed from office. So for Nixon, the House of Representatives is meeting to talk about this, and they're considering 3 charges of impeachment: obstruction of justice, violation of constitutional liberties, and refusal to produce evidence. Before the House can vote on these charges of impeachment, Nixon sees the writing on the wall and he resigns. So as of August 8th, 1974, Nixon resigns as president to avoid being impeached. And that allows him to not only avoid being impeached, but also being put on trial by the Senate and potentially being forcibly removed. Even though still to this date, we have never actually had an individual, or president at least, removed from office following impeachment. This allows him to avoid criminal charges in a potential trial on impeachment charges. And he also is able to avoid any fallout, any lingering charges by his successor, Gerald Ford, immediately pardoning him, which made a lot of people angry because there were folks who said, look, Nixon very clearly broke the law. That was all kinds of shady. He needs to be brought to justice, but that can't happen once he's pardoned. Gerald Ford's argument was that this was a colossal mess the United States had been dealing with for a while, and he just wanted us to move on from it. So the fallout from Watergate is this gets Congress to start questioning what else has been shady and going on that we don't know about. Is there other kind of abuses of executive power or authority that we're not aware of? And so Congress forms the Church Committee in 1973, named after Senator Frank Church. And this committee was designed to investigate the use of the executive branch or the presidency of agencies like the CIA, in which case the Church Committee found out about the use of the CIA to interfere in the domestic policies of other nations, like, for example, what we talked about in Chile. They also found reports of the FBI spying on millions of Americans illegally. And this horrified Congress that all of these things had been happening without the knowledge of the other branches of federal government. And so Congress starts passing laws in the wake of Watergate to curb the power of the FBI and the CIA to conduct business without congressional oversight. We also see Congress increasing the strength of the Freedom of Information Act, which was originally passed in 1966. They amended it and strengthened it in 1974. And this is designed to make the government accountable. Now, it doesn't mean that you can automatically get answers on whatever you want from the government. What the Freedom of Information Act does is you can make a request for information from the government. Let's say you want to know what really happened in Roswell, New Mexico in 47, 48, right? UFOs. Let's say you want to know more about UFOs. The US government then, under the Freedom of Information Act, is given a certain period of time to respond to your request. They can respond saying, okay, here you go, like here's the information. If they don't give you the information, they have to justify why not. So a very common reason for denial of Freedom of Information Act requests is it's a matter of national security, right? that it hasn't been declassified yet and it can't possibly be declassified yet, they have to give sufficient reason for why to deny you the information. Otherwise, if they can't give you sufficient reason, they have to release it. Okay. And this was designed to make government more accountable, because one of the lasting fallouts from Watergate is a lack of faith of the American people in government. They were really disillusioned by Nixon's abuse of the power of his office. Many people were horrified by the excesses of the CIA and the FBI that the Church Committee found out, and found out that this had lasted decades long without the knowledge of Congress or the American people. And so people started questioning the authority of government. And this fed into a rising conservative movement that felt that the best way to preserve freedom was to limit the power of government. So the idea of the government overreaching and overextending its power, needing to be reined in, works perfectly with this conservative notion of more limited government and more limited government power. So we're going to see this feature very heavily in this shift towards conservative politics that we see first at the local and state level, and then hitting the national level with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. All right, with that, I forgot I have one more slide. With that, I'm going to go ahead and ask if anybody has any questions about Nixon and Watergate. So Nixon becomes the second president to start the impeachment process, but he is not actually impeached.